Hi Miles, thanks for sending in your request for a video. I'll just read the question back to you just to make sure I'm understanding where you're coming from, and then I'm going to attempt to try to answer it for you and show you on my screen how I would do what you're after. So the question is, in regard to placing drawings onto worksheets, I have one project with floor plans drawn, but when I place them onto the worksheets, they don't line up with the other floors in the project. The ground floor starts in the top corner, the first floor is sort of in the center, then the roof plan is in the bottom corner. Also a question in regards to setting the scale and view size on the worksheets. Now I'm going to assume that what you mean by worksheets is actually to do with layouts. This makes the most sense in terms of how ArchiCAD works, but I will look at worksheets and what that means in ArchiCAD just because it has a different meaning. So we're going to assume that you're talking about layouts. So how do you place drawings onto layouts, and how do we align those to make sure that they line up between stories? And then, of course, how do we look at adjusting scale and the size on those layouts? To explain how to place drawings onto layouts, we're first going to have a look into the project map and understand how ArchiCAD is set up. When we look at the navigator on the right-hand side, we see that a project is broken up into stories. So that's the two-dimensional or the floor plan representation of the 3D model. Sections, which are the two-dimensional projections of the 3D or BIM model. Elevations, of course, the same but not cut through the building. Interior elevations, which are created by a detail, but again, ideally based on the 3D information. Worksheets are a different thing. Worksheets are an infinitely large two-dimensional universe which is built into each particular project. So what do we use a worksheet for? A worksheet is where we will draw something like a title block. This doesn't have any three-dimensional capability. If I right-click, there's no view in 3D, and you'll see that all of my design tools are grayed out. We can't do 3D stuff in a worksheet. That's only 2D elements. So it's great for things like title blocks or graphic scales or legends. Of course, I also use worksheets when I'm putting something into ArchiCAD or referencing something. So if I'm referencing a concept design or an engineer's drawing or a survey, that's what I'll place into the worksheets. Details is very similar. Details in ArchiCAD is where we import maybe details. So therefore, what's the difference between worksheets? Not much. But details can also be where we're taking a detail representation of the model and then exploding it. Now, I'm not a real big fan of this process in ArchiCAD. We can, of course, just draw two-dimensional details in here as well if we want to. The reason why I don't like ArchiCAD's detail method or tool is because it creates a whole lot of mess. It creates 2D lines and 2D fills based on the 3D model, which can then be updated. But if you want to edit it, you're editing basically garbage. Rather than editing lots of little bits of lines and fills, I'd prefer to represent those or redraw those myself. Or just avoid two-dimensional detailing altogether. So we also have 3D documents. We won't get into any of the rest of this. Once we've created things in our project map, we can then save them as saved views. And so what's really important here is that we have saved views which represent what we want to place on the layout. When I see some people practicing this, and even the way that some people teach, they basically skip this view map stage, going straight from the project map directly to the layout book. And I'll explain the way that this is done. So once we have a drawing or a view, here we see information, and I've just turned on all of my layers in order to see this drawing, and we can see that it's very messy. Instead, we would normally need to use layer combinations. This can be found under Options, Element Attributes, Layers, and layer combinations here. So I might choose Floor Documentation, which then we see clears this up drawing a lot. Now, once I've got this, I could right-click, Save View, and Place on Layout. And by doing so, skip the step of view map and go straight to layout book. I don't like this. The reality is it's still creating a save view, it's just doing it somewhere unknown. So if I do this process, right click, save and place on layout, click place on the layout, we have our saved view, and we see it's placed a drawing or a view map onto the layout, and it's the layout where I was based at just recently. And when we expand this, we see that this is based on this number 4.first, and then we have to go back one step and find out, well, where did that get saved to? And we see that generally it gets saved to the bottom of this list. So the real truth of the matter is we can never actually skip the view map or the saved view stage, but I don't want to do it accidentally. Instead, I want to do it very deliberately. So we'll delete that. And we'll also delete this. We'll see that this basically keeps the view, but it's no longer referenced to anything. So when we go into the settings, it's not actually linked. So we'd have to link it to something, which means it will never be updated as well. So let's delete that. And instead, we'll go back to our drawing. Here we can see that I've got a roof plan, a loft floor plan, a first floor plan, and an upper ground floor plan. And we're going to save all of these. And I've already, of course, saved each of these. And so we can see, just like we skip through by double clicking in the stories, we can also do that with the save views. Most importantly, let's look at how to do this, and we'll go down to the lower ground floor and the studio in order to represent this. We see that there is nothing there. The lower ground floor is because it's just footings. So if I was to turn on all my layers, we'd see there's a lot more information there. So I could save this. Let's save this one as well. Save current view is how we're going to do that. We see here though, that's a bit of a strange one. It says layer combination custom. And while I'm here, I can change this. So let's change this instead to footings, AED plan footings. And then when I press create, we see that some of those things will change because I've deliberately changed the layer combination, which means changing the layers that are visible. And now this is simply added to our list. If I go back into each one of these or any one of these under view settings, right click view settings, we can see that we can change the layer combination, the scale, and a lot of other settings that we're not going to get into right now. Once we've created these views, we can then place it on a layout. Let's go up to the roof plan on page 2000. Here we see that the numbering system is of course just based on a subset. And that just means that as we go through from our site all the way down to our detailing and schedules and even 3D visualizations, they just follow a sequential pattern, but we're leaving lots and lots of space in case we need to have potentially 100 or 1,000 pages in each sequence. So in order to place this drawing, we're going to drag and drop a save view into our layout book, and that's as complicated as it needs to get. But what we see when that happens is that things get placed in rather awkward positions. Again, if I do that again, it's partly based on where I choose to drag and drop, but I'm never going to be able to drag and drop perfectly into position each time. So what do I do? How do I get that to be in the right position? Well, let's delete one of these. And we'll have a look at one of these save views. And then we see that there's two parts. There's this title thing, which is a little bit awkward. And of course, there's the view or the view map, viewing part of our model. Now, if I go into the settings of my view map, I can change the way that this imports. I can change the frames to fit frame to drawing. And what that will do is we'll expand the view to fit everything on the screen in that save view. So this can be useful. Otherwise, what was it doing? It was just saving the view as it was when I saved it. So therefore, it was cutting off anything that I wasn't currently looking at when I press save. So once I've done this, I can probably then decide I don't want to keep all of this information. I can move it into position. If I want to be exact, maybe I want to run a diagonal line through my drawing. Maybe I just go from corner to corner. In this case, the blue outline represents the extent of our boundary or extent of our printable area. And so I could select the drawing. Here I don't want to choose the middle. Instead, maybe I want to choose the middle of the building, and I don't need to be precise at all. At the moment, this is just a bit whimsical, but just trying to center the drawing. If I wanted to move it precisely, I could of course do that as well. Let's get rid of those lines. And now if I want to shrink down this box, I can just click on the edge, left click in this case, use offset edge, and bring that into a point where I'm happy with it. I don't need to see a whole lot at the moment. And just to explain how this can go wrong, I'm deliberately going to keep this quite tight. So we're limiting this drawing quite a lot. Let's make it really tight here. And then the title, we see that the title didn't move with it, which is a little bit awkward. If we go into the settings, the title can be adjusted and we can change the type of title. I'm not going to go into too much of the settings of the title here, except to note that we can actually adjust it if we want to. And I have customized mine. All we're going to do for now is just pick it up, drag it, and move it, and lock it in place at the bottom, and then we'll just give it a bit of space, just so it's not squished. All right, now you might say, do I need a drawing title? No, you don't. I like drawing titles because it is the best way in ArchiCAD to be able to both describe the name of this drawing and also to give the scale of this drawing. If you leave this into the title block, you can of course do the name, which in this case is just based on the layout name, which I've described here. But you can't do scale really well. You'd have to do it manually. You can't do it automatically, because if I have different drawings with different scales, it's going to screw it up. It's not going to represent it properly. So next question, how do we make sure that they are all aligned? So I could have the roof plan on this page, and then I could do the same thing with my loft, drag it across, and it's not in the right place. What do I do about that? Let's look at a couple of ways to fix this problem. First way, ideally, and this doesn't always work, is once we've created a drawing and once we've set up the way that we want it to be, I can Alt, pick up the settings, and then when I drag and drop a new view, theoretically it should bring the same settings in. So in this case, the settings are pretty much the same, so there's not much that has changed, but we still see that the title block is still separated. We still see that the view isn't necessarily the same shape. So that will give it theoretically the same settings, but in this case, it's not that much. What would it change? So let's say, for instance, I created a copy of this. In this case, we'll drag a copy, and I decided to turn off the title block. And let's just do some crazy stuff. Let's change the scale here to 1:100, and we'll change the rotation to 45 degrees. So if I now pick up the settings of this, and then import, that's when we see that some of the settings that we've saved start to take effect. It didn't change the scale, it did change the rotation, and it did turn off the title block. So that's what picking up the settings of the save views will do. It's still not really what we want though, is it? It's not that easy. Let's look at a much better way of doing this. In order to get this drawing exactly in the right place, we could bring it in. Let's pick up the settings as it was before, because that's awkward. Alt, pick up settings, loft, bring it in. And we can use trace reference. So let's turn on the trace reference. That's this little box here, or two boxes. We can also just right click and say show as trace reference, and that's going to choose to reflect that the way that we want it. Now what do I need to do? I need to go into the settings and I need to adjust the frame so that it's fit to drawing, so I can see everything that I need. And then I can move, drag, find a point of reference. In this case, I'll just choose the middle of the A. It's not necessarily a very good way of doing it, particularly if you miss. Let's do that again. So we see that's perfectly aligned. I could choose any other building element. I could choose the outside of the wall edge. It doesn't really matter. It's going to still line up in the right place. And then I can pick up the title box and move it into place. And we see that they're now perfectly aligned. And as before, I could then shrink this view down if I wanted to. So that's one way. But again, that took a bit of work. So there's got to be a better way. Yes, there is. Let's do this again, but this time we'll copy paste. Right click, copy, first floor, paste. And while we're at it, let's do upper ground first, upper ground floor plan as well. Now we see that we've pasted the same plan onto these three layouts. So it's sort of right, they're in the right place, but of course it's the wrong drawing. But what we can do, once we've placed a drawing, we can select it, right click, link drawing to, and then choose a different save view to relate it to. So here we just choose first in this case, and upper ground floor. And I know I'm making some mistakes, but that's deliberate. Link drawing to upper ground floor, and we see that works perfectly, almost. What's wrong? The framing is wrong. So we see that the problem is that it's cut stuff off. So unless we go back into fit frame to drawing, which will increase everything and won't necessarily keep it in the right place, what we then need to do is to be diligent to see, am I cutting something off? Yes, I am. Let's click that outside edge and extend it, decide how much we want to keep, and then happy with that result. Let's do that here as well. Click, extend, update frame. We're seeing what we want. We see we've chopped it off a bit on this side. Let's do the same thing. Great. So we've got everything that we want, and now they're perfectly aligned. If I wasn't sure, of course, what I can do is go upper ground floor, show as trace reference to first floor, and we see that they're perfectly aligned. Now, of course, I'm just putting one thing on a very large layout. This is an A1 drawing, and it's a relatively small house, but I work with some very, very large projects as well. So in this case, it's really just to keep it simple for the sake of this video, but the same principles apply. Now, we looked before at scale, and we can change scale in a few different ways. So if I select this and go into the settings, I can change the size and appearance, meaning that I'm overriding the scale. So I can change the magnification. So if I make that 50%, what's that doing? Of course, it's changing the drawing scale. So 50% is making the drawing smaller. And we see that it automatically resizes to be smaller, but this doesn't necessarily work very well. What's the other problem? It's changing the size of the font. So if I change that again, back to 50%, the drawing's not getting squished or messy. It's just the text size is getting smaller, if that makes sense. What do I mean? What's the alternative to that? So rather than magnifying our drawing, if I went into my actual view and then changed it here from 1 to 50 to 1 to 100, we'd see that the text becomes horrible. Now, what's changed? The text and the dimensions are actually the same size. They haven't got bigger. It's just the zoom that we're representing has got smaller, and the text size has remained consistent the whole time. And we see in this case that's 3 millimeters. So I always recommend using a minimum of 3 millimeters if we're going to then be able to reduce our layout from A1 to A3, or another way of saying that would be using a minimum of 1.5 millimeters if we're going to be able to print at scale, such as printing on an A3 drawing. So when we go back to here, we don't really want to change the scale. We can change the scale if we want to for magnification purposes, only maybe for presentation. I wouldn't do this for technical documentation because it's going to mess with our scale representation of text, and we don't want to do things like that. Hopefully that's answered all your questions. If you decide at any point you want to change this representation, maybe you need to see this in more detail, maybe you want to bump up the amount of information that you are viewing, then I would suggest the best way to change that scale is to go into here, change the scale properly. We see that ArchiEd unfortunately doesn't have a scale of something like 1 to 25, which of course would be half of 1 to 50. We can go custom, and then we can type that in. If this happens that it goes blank, that's fine. It just means that it's off the screen. If we press update, we see that will work. And then of course, like before, if we go back to our frame and then choose fit frame to drawing, that's going to allow us to see everything. And then we can just resize this back to where it needs to be. Now what we will find is that this doesn't fit onto our page anymore. So we'd need to have a view that was okay with cutting out all of these dimensions, or of course, we could shrink these dimensions in. We could make them a lot closer together if we decided we wanted to work at a scale of something like 1 to 25 instead of 1 to 50. Is there an area of ArchiCAD that you would like to learn or have a question answered? Become a patron of ArchiEd and request a video. I'll personally provide you with a tutorial answering your question, and you will be contributing to our global learning community. Request a video today at ArchiEd.